The candles had barely settled into their soft glow when the shouting began inside Elena Whitmore's chest, though her voice, when it finally broke free, was calm and cutting. "You will not speak to my father that way in his own house," she said, standing so quickly her chair scraped against the floor, and every head at the table turned toward her. The man across the table, a stranger introduced only as Mr. Ashford, lifted an eyebrow as if she were a curiosity rather than a threat. He had spent the last 20 minutes dismantling her father's proposal piece by piece, not with careful questions, but with open contempt, calling the estate's harvest numbers laughable and the household staff careless for a spilled drop of wine on the tablecloth. Elena had watched her father's shoulders curl inward with every word, watched the color drain from his face, and something in her refused to let it continue. Edmund Whitmore reached for his daughter's arm under the table, a silent plea for her to sit, to breathe, to remember that this man held the fate of their family's livelihood in his hands. But Elena had never been good at silence when silence meant watching someone she loved be humiliated. "Elena," her father whispered, though it came out strangled. "No," she said, not looking away from the guest. "I have listened to him insult this house for half an hour. I will not listen any longer." The dining room, usually filled with the comfortable clink of silverware and quiet conversation, had gone utterly still. Even the housekeeper, who had been refilling water glasses near the sideboard, froze mid-step. Mr. Ashford set down his glass slowly, deliberately, the way a man does when he wants everyone to notice the calm in his hands, even as the air around him has grown sharp. He studied Elena the way one might study an unfamiliar animal, uncertain whether it was dangerous or simply unafraid. "You misunderstand me," he said, his voice low and even. "I was merely being honest about the state of this estate's finances." "There is a difference between honesty and cruelty," Elena replied. "You chose cruelty. You mocked the way my father speaks. You mocked the meal my aunt spent all afternoon preparing. You called the maid clumsy for an accident that was not her fault. None of that was honesty. That was contempt, and I will not sit here and pretend otherwise simply because you have money." A soft gasp came from somewhere near the far end of the table. Her father's hand tightened around his napkin as though it were the only thing keeping him upright. For a long moment nobody moved. Elena felt her pulse hammering in her throat, felt the weight of every eye in the room, but she did not sit down. She had said what needed saying, and she would not take it back simply because the silence afterward felt unbearable. Mr. Ashford's jaw tightened, the faintest flicker of something crossing his expression, gone before anyone could name it. He rose from his chair, unhurried, and reached for his coat draped over the back of it. "It seems," he said, "that I am no longer welcome at this table." "You made yourself unwelcome the moment you opened your mouth," Elena said, though her voice had begun just slightly to shake. He looked at her once more, a long, unreadable look, then turned and walked out without another word. The front door closed behind him with a heavy, final sound that seemed to echo through the whole house. The moment he was gone, the room erupted into whispers. Her aunt pressed a hand to her chest. A cousin muttered something about ruin, but it was her father's face that Elena could not stop looking at, pale and stricken, staring at the door as though watching his future disappear through it. "Elena," he said, his voice barely above a breath, "do you understand what you have done?" "I defended you," she said. "I defended this family. You have likely destroyed us," he said, and though he did not raise his voice, the words landed harder than any shout could have. "That man was our last chance. Do you understand how many doors have already closed to us this year? How many investors have turned away the moment they heard the name Whitmore? He was willing to hear us out. He was willing, and you." He stopped himself, pressing his fingers to his temples, and Elena felt something cold settle low in her stomach. Not regret exactly, but the first creeping edge of fear. "I could not sit there and let him speak to you like that," she said quietly, "like you were nothing." "Sometimes," her father said, sinking back into his chair as though the strength had left his legs, "we must swallow our pride to survive. I have swallowed mine more times than I can count. I did not think I would have to teach my daughter to do the same, but perhaps I was wrong not to." The words stung more than any shouting could have. Elena stood there, feeling the eyes of relatives who had gone quiet with a mixture of sympathy and judgment, feeling the enormity of what had just happened settle over the room like a fog that would not lift. Later that night, long after the guests had gone and the candles had burned low, Elena sat alone in the small study her father used for his ledgers, staring at columns of numbers that told a story she already knew by heart. The estate her father managed belonged to a family that had grown impatient with slow returns. Investors had come and gone, each one more skeptical than the last. Mr. Ashford had been, as her father said, perhaps their final hope, a man with the resources to save what little stability they had left. She thought of the way he had spoken to the maid, the careless flick of disdain in his voice when he mentioned the tablecloth, the way he had looked at her father as though he were beneath consideration entirely. She did not regret defending her family. She could not make herself regret it, no matter how hard she tried to convince herself that regret was the responsible thing to feel. And yet, beneath the anger, a small and persistent voice asked her what she had truly done. Who was this man, really, beyond his cold manner and his tailored coat? He'd arrived with letters of introduction from people her father trusted, had been described as a man of considerable means with an interest in struggling estates. Beyond that, she realized with a small jolt, she knew almost nothing about him at all. She closed the ledger, rubbed her tired eyes, and told herself that whatever came next, she would face it the same way she had faced tonight, without apology for standing up for what was right, even if the cost turned out to be more than she had imagined. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the old windows of the house, and somewhere in the dark countryside, a carriage rolled away from their gate and toward a house far grander than anything the Whitmores had ever known, carrying a man whose true name Elena had not yet learned, and whose reach into their lives had only just begun. She did not sleep well that night. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw her father's stricken face, heard the door close with that final heavy sound. She told herself it did not matter, that pride and dignity were worth more than any investor's approval. But somewhere beneath that certainty, a quieter fear had begun to grow. The fear that she had, in a single unguarded moment, changed the course of her family's future in ways she could not yet see, and could certainly not undo. By morning, the house was unusually quiet. Her father had left early for the fields, unable to face her, or perhaps unwilling to say something he might later regret. Elena wandered through the empty rooms, replaying the dinner over and over, searching for some detail she might have missed, something that would explain the strange, sharp look Mr. Ashford had given her just before he left. It had not been anger exactly. It had been something closer to surprise, as though no one had spoken to him that way in a very long time. She had no way of knowing, not yet, just how true that thought was, or how much it would come to matter. At breakfast, her aunt Clara Hollis, who had lived with the family since Elena's mother passed, tried to smooth the tension with idle talk about the weather and the harvest, but the effort felt thin against the heaviness still hanging in the air. Elena picked at her food without appetite, aware of the careful way her aunt avoided mentioning the previous evening at all, as though naming it might make the damage worse. "He will come to his senses," her aunt finally said, setting down her cup. "Your father is a proud man, but he loves you. He will not stay angry forever." "It is not his anger I am worried about," Elena admitted. "It is what we lose if that man does not return. Father said there were no other investors left to ask." Her aunt reached across the table and covered Elena's hand with her own, weathered and warm. "You did not do anything wrong, dear girl. You defended your family. There is no shame in that, whatever the cost may be." Elena wanted to believe her, wanted the words to settle the storm inside her chest, but doubt lingered stubbornly beneath the comfort. She thought again of her father's face, the way his voice had cracked when he asked if she understood what she had done. She did understand, more than he perhaps realized. She understood that pride without security was a dangerous thing to hold on to, and yet she also understood that some lines, once crossed by a stranger, could not simply be ignored for the sake of convenience. Later that morning, she walked the narrow path along the edge of the eastern field, where the wheat had not yet been cut, hoping the open air might quiet her thoughts. The estate itself was not large by the standards of the county, but it was the only home she had ever known, its stone walls and worn wooden gates carrying the memory of generations before her. Losing it was not an abstract fear. It was the loss of everything familiar, everything that had shaped her. She found her father near the old stone fence at the far end of the property, staring out at the fields as though searching for answers in the swaying grass. He did not turn when she approached, though she knew he had heard her footsteps. "I am not sorry for what I said," she told him quietly, standing beside him. "But I am sorry for what it might cost you. That much I do regret." Her father was silent for a long moment before he finally spoke, his voice rougher than usual. "You remind me of your mother," he said. "She never could stand by while someone was treated unfairly, no matter what it cost her. I loved that about her, even when it frightened me." Elena felt something loosen in her chest at those words, though the fear had not entirely gone. "Do you think there is any chance he will reconsider?" Her father shook his head slowly. "I do not know. Men like that are not accustomed to being challenged. We may simply have to wait and see what comes of it, and prepare ourselves for the worst in the meantime." They stood together in silence after that, watching the wind move through the unharvested wheat, neither of them aware that within a matter of days, A letter would arrive that would upend everything they thought they understood about the man who had walked out of their dining room the night before. The letter arrived 4 days later, carried by a rider on a horse far finer than anything the local post ever used, its leather saddle polished and its bridle trimmed in silver. Elena watched from the upstairs window as the rider dismounted at the gate and handed a sealed envelope to the housekeeper, then waited, as though instructed to bring back a reply. Her stomach twisted with an uneasy feeling she could not name. By the time she reached the front hall, her father was already standing there with the envelope in his hands, staring at the wax seal pressed into it, a crest she did not recognize, an emblem of a hawk in flight above 2 crossed swords. His face had gone pale. "Father," she said, "what is it?" He did not answer at first. He broke the seal with unsteady fingers and unfolded the thick paper inside, his eyes moving over the lines once, then again, as though he could not quite believe what he was reading. When he finally looked up at her, his expression was a mixture of disbelief and something close to dread. "It is from His Grace," he said slowly, "the Duke of Ashford." Elena felt the floor seem to tilt beneath her. "The Duke of Ashford," she repeated. "I do not understand. We have never received correspondence from the Duke." "We have now," her father said, and there was a tremor in his voice that frightened her more than anything he had said the night of the dinner. "Elena, the man who sat at our table, the man you spoke to so boldly, the man whose invitation you refused to soften your words for, that was not a Mr. Ashford come to evaluate our proposal on behalf of an investor. That was the Duke himself, Julian Ashford. He owns nearly half the land in this county, including the very fields we stand on every day. He did not come to us as a hired representative. He came in disguise, testing the estate for himself before deciding whether it was worth his attention at all." The words landed like a physical blow. Elena reached for the back of a nearby chair to steady herself, her mind racing back through every moment of that dinner, every sharp remark she had made, every accusation she had thrown across the table at a man she had believed to be nothing more than an arrogant investor with more money than manners. She had called him cruel to his face. She had ordered him to leave his own land. "He allowed us to believe he was someone else," she said, though even as she spoke the words, she understood that this fact changed nothing about what he had said, or how he had said it. "That does not excuse the way he behaved." "Perhaps not," her father said, "but it changes everything about the position we are now in. Read this." He handed her the letter, and she scanned the elegant, precise handwriting with growing disbelief. The letter was brief, formal in tone, offering no apology, and no explanation for the deception, only a request, phrased with the unmistakable authority of a man unaccustomed to being refused. It stated that His Grace wished to speak privately with Miss Elena Whitmore at Ashford Hall, at her earliest convenience, regarding a matter of some importance concerning the estate and its future. Not her father. Her. "Why would he wish to see me?" Elena asked, though the question felt hollow even as she spoke it. She already sensed, somewhere beneath the fear, that this summons had everything to do with the words she had spoken to him at that table, words no one, apparently, had dared to say to him in a very long time. Her father folded the letter carefully, his hands still unsteady. "I do not know what he intends. It could be an opportunity to make amends, or it could be a chance for him to punish us properly, away from witnesses. Either way, Elena, we cannot afford to refuse a summons from a man who holds half the deeds in this county, including the lease on the very house we are standing in." The weight of that truth settled over her slowly. She had known, in the abstract way one knows uncomfortable facts, that the estate her father managed was not truly theirs, that the land belonged to powerful families who rarely appeared in person, content to collect their returns from a distance. She had never imagined that the man responsible for their fate had sat across from her at dinner, eating a meal her aunt had prepared, listening to her defend a household he could dissolve with a single signature. "I will go," she said finally, though her voice was quieter than she intended. "Whatever he wants to say to me, I would rather hear it directly than spend every day waiting for the ruin to arrive unannounced." Her father studied her for a long moment, something like reluctant pride flickering across his tired features. "You have your mother's courage," he said. "I only hope it is enough to see you through this." That night, Elena barely slept, turning over every possible reason the Duke might have for such a summons. Perhaps he intended to demand a public apology, to humiliate her, the way she had, in his eyes, humiliated him. Perhaps he intended something crueler still, using the estate's future as leverage to force her into some kind of submission. She imagined a dozen different scenarios, each one worse than the last, until exhaustion finally pulled her into a restless, dreamless sleep. The following morning her aunt helped her dress with unusual care, smoothing the folds of her plainest good dress, the only one suitable for a visit to a duke's estate, though it was still far simpler than anything the household staff at Ashford Hall likely wore on ordinary days. "Remember who you are," her aunt told her, adjusting a loose strand of hair. "Whatever he says to you, whatever he threatens, you owed him no apology last night, and you owe him none today. A title does not excuse cruelty, no matter how grand the house that title comes with." Elena held on to those words as the carriage, arranged and paid for by her father despite the family's tightening finances, carried her down the long road toward Ashford Hall. The estate came into view gradually, first as a distant silhouette against the hills, then as a sprawling structure of gray stone and towering windows, far grander than anything she had imagined even after learning the truth of who Mr. Ashford truly was. The carriage rolled to a stop at the base of a wide stone staircase, and a servant in fine livery stepped forward to open the door. Elena descended slowly, smoothing her skirts, forcing her chin up despite the way her heart hammered against her ribs. She had faced the Duke once already without knowing his true identity, and it had cost her nothing but a difficult conversation with her father. Now she knew exactly who waited for her inside, and the knowledge made every step toward that grand entrance feel heavier than the last. Inside, the hall was vast, filled with portraits of stern-faced ancestors and polished floors that reflected the pale morning light pouring through tall windows. A steward led her through a maze of corridors, past rooms she caught only fleeting glimpses of, each one more opulent than anything she had seen in her life, until finally they arrived at a set of heavy wooden doors. "His Grace is expecting you," the steward said, and opened the door before she could gather herself further. The room beyond was a study, lined with shelves of leather-bound books and warmed by a low fire despite the mild weather outside. Julian Ashford stood near the window, his back to her at first, his posture rigid in a way that suggested he too was bracing himself for whatever this meeting might become. He turned as the door closed behind her, and for a long moment, neither of them spoke. Elena studied his face carefully, searching for the contempt she remembered from the dinner table, but found instead something far more difficult to read, an expression caught somewhere between wariness and reluctant respect. "Miss Whitmore," he said finally, "thank you for coming." "I was not aware I had a choice," she replied, unable to keep the edge entirely out of her voice. A faint, humorless smile touched his mouth. "No," he admitted. "I suppose you did not. I apologize for that, though I imagine an apology from me carries little weight after the way our first meeting ended." Elena said nothing, waiting, unwilling to fill the silence with reassurances she did not yet feel. Julian studied her for a long moment, then gestured toward a chair near the fire. "Please, sit," he said. "What I have to say may take some time, and I would rather you hear all of it before you decide what to think of me." She hesitated, then sat, her hands folded tightly in her lap, bracing herself for whatever judgment or demand was about to follow. Whatever she had expected walking through those doors, it had not been the quiet uncertainty she now saw in the face of the most powerful man in the county, a man who, for reasons she could not yet understand, seemed almost as unsettled by this meeting as she was. "You must have many questions," Julian said, moving to sit across from her rather than behind the imposing desk near the window, a small gesture that surprised her. "I will try to answer what I can, though I imagine some of my reasons will not satisfy you." "You could begin with why you deceived my father," Elena said. "Why introduce yourself under a false name at all, if you intended to judge the estate honestly?" "Because titles change the way people speak to me," he said, his voice low. "The moment a man learns he is addressing a duke, he stops telling me the truth. He tells me what he thinks I wish to hear. I wanted to see the estate as it truly is, not as it would be presented to flatter my position. Your father's numbers, his methods, his honesty about the difficulties he faces, all of it was more valuable to me, observed plainly, than dressed up for a title." Elena considered this, unwilling to let her guard down entirely, though she could not deny a certain logic in what he described. "And did you learn what you hoped to learn?" "I learned that your father is a capable man doing his best with limited resources," Julian said. "And I learned that his daughter is willing to risk everything to protect him, even when doing so seems reckless." "Reckless," she repeated, feeling the old anger flicker back to life. "Is that what you call it? Defending my family from a guest who mocked them at their own table?" "I call it rare," he said, and something in his tone made her look at him more closely. "I have sat at a great many tables, Miss Whitmore, surrounded by people eager to agree with whatever I say, careful never to offend a man who could ruin them with a word. Not one of them has ever stood up and told me I was behaving badly. Not one, until you." Elena did not know how to respond to that. She had braced herself for anger, for punishment, for the cold recitation of consequences she would now face for her outburst. She had not prepared herself for something that sounded unmistakably like admiration, however reluctant. That does not make what you said to my father, or to the household staff, any less unkind, she said carefully, unwilling to let the moment soften her resolve entirely. No, Julian agreed. It does not. And for that, I do owe an apology, though I suspect you will not accept one easily, nor should you. The fire crackled in the silence that followed, and Elena studied the man across from her, trying to reconcile the cold, dismissive guest from that dinner table with the quieter, more careful figure sitting before her now. Something had shifted in his manner since that night, though she could not yet say what, or why. Why did you truly ask me here, she said finally, and not my father? If this concerns the estate's future, surely he is the one you should be speaking with. Julian was quiet for a long moment, his gaze drifting toward the fire as though gathering the words carefully before he spoke them. Because what I wish to discuss is not only about numbers and leases, he said at last. There is a reason I arrived at your father's table the way I did, guarded and short-tempered in a manner unlike myself on most days. I owe you an explanation for that, if you are willing to hear it, though it is not a simple story to tell. Elena felt a flicker of curiosity cut through her wariness, despite herself. Whatever she had imagined this meeting might hold, it had not been this. A duke prepared to explain himself to the daughter of an estate manager he had insulted only days before, his composure slipping just enough to reveal something rawer underneath. I am listening, she said quietly, and settled back into her chair, sensing that whatever came next would change the shape of everything she thought she understood about the man sitting across from her. Julian rose from his chair and walked slowly toward the window, his hands clasped behind his back, staring out at the wide grounds beyond the glass as though the words he needed were somewhere out there among the hedges and distant trees, waiting to be gathered. A little over a year ago, he began, I entered into a business arrangement with a man named Gerald Fenwick, a merchant I had known since my early years managing my father's affairs. He was clever, charming, and utterly convincing. I trusted him with a considerable portion of the estate's holdings, an investment in shipping routes that promised significant returns within a short span of time. I did not simply hand him money. I brought him into my closest circle. I introduced him to my sister. I defended him publicly when other men in the county questioned his methods. He paused, his jaw tightening slightly before he continued. 6 months later, the ships never sailed. The routes did not exist. Fenwick had fabricated the entire venture, using my name and my trust to draw in other investors as well. Men who lost far more than I did. Men who came to my door afterward demanding I make right what he had stolen, as though I had orchestrated the deception myself rather than falling for it as thoroughly as they had. Elena listened, the anger she had carried into the room slowly giving way to something quieter, more complicated. That must have been devastating, she said. Not only the loss, but the betrayal of someone you trusted so completely. It was, Julian admitted, turning back to face her. But the money, in truth, mattered less than what it taught me. I learned that people rarely tell a duke the truth. They tell him what serves their own interests, and dress it in flattering language until it sounds like loyalty. Fenwick was the most skilled flatterer I have ever known. By the time I understood what he truly was, he had already vanished with what he could carry, leaving me to face the consequences of trusting him. And so you stopped trusting anyone, Elena said quietly, understanding beginning to dawn. That is why you arrived at my father's table under a false name. That is why you were so quick to look for flaws, so quick to assume the worst. Yes, Julian said. I have spent the better part of a year assuming that every proposal brought to me conceals some hidden weakness, that every smile across a dinner table is calculated rather than genuine. It has made me, I am aware, a difficult man to deal with. Perhaps a cruel one, as you said so plainly that night. Elena studied him, the cold, dismissive stranger from that dinner slowly reshaping itself in her mind into something far more human, a man scarred by betrayal and struggling, imperfectly, to protect himself from being wounded again. It did not excuse the way he had spoken to her father, or to the household staff, but it explained it in a way that softened the edges of her anger, however reluctantly. That does not make it right, she said, but I understand it better now. I do not ask you to excuse it, Julian said, only to understand that the man who insulted your father's table was not entirely himself that evening. I had received a letter from one of Fenwick's former partners only hours before, a man attempting the same kind of manipulation I had already fallen victim to once. I arrived at your door already braced for deception, already certain I would find some hidden flaw to expose. Instead, I found a family working honestly within difficult circumstances, and a daughter unafraid to tell me precisely what she thought of my behavior. He returned to his chair, sitting slowly, his earlier composure replaced by something more tired, more genuine. In truth, Miss Whitmore, no one has spoken to me the way you did in a very long time. Everyone around me has learned to measure their words carefully, weighing every sentence against what it might cost them. You did not weigh anything. You simply told me the truth. Consequences be damned. I have thought of little else since that night. Elena felt heat rise in her cheeks, uncertain how to respond to such an admission. I did not intend to teach you anything, she said. I only intended to defend my father. And yet you did teach me something, Julian said. You reminded me that honesty still exists, even among people with far less power than I hold, perhaps especially among them. It is a lesson I did not know I needed until you delivered it so unflinchingly. They sat in silence for a moment, the fire settling lower in the grate, and Elena found herself studying the man before her with new eyes, no longer simply the cold stranger from that dinner table, but someone more layered, more wounded, than she had allowed herself to imagine. What of my father's proposal? She asked finally, steering the conversation back toward practical ground, uncertain how much longer she could sit in the weight of his confession without losing her composure entirely. Is that why you summoned me here, to explain yourself, or is there still a decision to be made about the estate? Julian nodded, seeming almost grateful for the shift toward more solid footing. There is a decision, yes. I have reviewed the figures your father submitted, along with the records from the past several years. Whatever my behavior that evening, my assessment of the estate's potential was not clouded by it. Your father runs an efficient operation under difficult conditions. I intend to renew his contract and to extend the investment he originally requested, on terms considerably more generous than what he proposed. Elena stared at him, certain for a moment she had misheard. You intend to help us, after everything that happened? I intend to help your father, because he has earned it through his own competence, not out of pity, and not to make amends for my behavior, though I hope this decision demonstrates some measure of respect for what your family has built, despite the odds against it, Julian said. I do not offer generosity easily, Miss Whitmore. I offer it when it is deserved, and your father has deserved it for some time, whether or not I chose to acknowledge that fact sooner. Relief flooded through Elena so suddenly it left her momentarily breathless, the weight she had carried since that terrible dinner beginning, at last, to lift. Thank you, she said quietly. You do not know what this will mean to him, to all of us. I imagine I have some idea, Julian said, having seen the fear in his eyes that night, though I did not fully understand its cause until later, when I learned how close the estate had come to losing its final chance at stability. They spoke for a while longer, the conversation drifting from the practical matters of the estate toward more unexpected territory. Julian asking after her own thoughts on the harvest methods her father employed, listening with genuine interest as she described the small improvements she had suggested over the years, changes that had, in small but meaningful ways, helped keep the estate afloat during difficult seasons. She found herself surprised by how easily the conversation flowed once the tension between them eased, surprised by how attentively he listened, how few interruptions he offered compared to the dismissive manner she remembered from their first meeting. You know a great deal about estate management for someone who insists she is merely her father's assistant, Julian observed at one point, a faint trace of genuine warmth in his voice for the first time since she had entered the room. I have spent my whole life watching him work, Elena said. It seemed foolish not to learn something from it. Foolish, Julian repeated, something like a smile touching the corner of his mouth. I find very little about you foolish, Miss Whitmore. Reckless, perhaps, as I said before, but not foolish. Elena felt herself flush again, unsure whether to take the words as teasing or genuine compliment. Uncertain, too, why it mattered so much to her which one it was. She reminded herself, firmly, that this man remained the Duke of Ashford, a figure whose world was as distant from her own as the moon from the fields she walked each morning. Whatever ease had settled between them in this quiet study did not change the vast difference in their circumstances, a difference she suspected would matter a great deal more once she stepped beyond these walls and back into the world that measured people so carefully by their titles and their fortunes. As the meeting drew to its natural close, Julian rose and walked her to the door himself, waving away the steward who moved to escort her instead. At the threshold he paused, studying her with an expression she could not quite name, something between gratitude and reluctance, as though he had more to say, and had not yet decided whether saying it was wise. I hope, he said finally, that this will not be the last time we speak, Miss Whitmore. Beyond the matter of the estate, I find myself curious to know more of your thoughts on a great many things, if you would permit it. Elena hesitated, aware of how quickly the ground beneath her had shifted since that terrible dinner, aware too of how unfamiliar this new terrain felt. A duke, expressing interest in her opinions, as though they carried genuine weight rather than being merely tolerated out of politeness. I suppose, she said carefully, that depends on what those conversations might concern. Nothing you need fear, Julian said. Only honesty, Miss Whitmore. It seems to be in short supply everywhere else in my life. She left Ashford Hall that afternoon with her mind spinning, the carriage ride home passing in a blur of half-formed thoughts she could not quite untangle. She had arrived expecting judgment, perhaps even ruin, and had instead found an explanation she had not anticipated, an offer of genuine help for her family, and something else entirely, something she was not yet ready to name, stirring quietly beneath the relief and the lingering uncertainty of all she had learned that day. When she told her father the news that evening, his relief was immediate and overwhelming, tears gathering in his eyes as he embraced her tightly, murmuring words of gratitude she barely registered through her own tangled emotions. The estate was safe, for now. Her family's future had been secured through means she never could have predicted only days earlier. And yet, as she lay awake that night, it was not the relief over the estate that occupied her thoughts most persistently, but the memory of Julian Ashford's voice, quiet and unguarded, admitting that no one had spoken to him honestly and longer than he cared to say, and that her honesty, reckless as it had seemed in the moment, had somehow mattered to him more than she ever could have anticipated. In the weeks that followed, the renewed contract brought a steady stream of changes to the estate. New equipment arrived for the eastern fields, funded by the terms Julian had promised, and her father moved through his days with a lightness Elena had not seen in him for years, the constant strain of uncertain finances finally easing from his shoulders. She watched him hum softly while reviewing the ledgers in the evenings, watched the color return fully to his face, and felt a quiet satisfaction that whatever risk she had taken that first night, it had, against all odds, led them somewhere better rather than somewhere worse. What she had not expected was how often Julian himself would appear at the estate in the weeks that followed, arriving under the reasonable pretext of reviewing the improvements firsthand, though Elena began to suspect, as the visits grew more frequent, that the fields were not the only reason for his presence. He would arrive on horseback in the late morning, spend an hour walking the property with her father, discussing crop rotations and irrigation, and then, more often than not, find some reason to linger afterward, drawn into conversation with Elena on the garden path, or near the old stone fence where she often walked to clear her thoughts. Their conversations rarely touched on anything so simple as the weather or polite pleasantries. Julian seemed to have little patience for empty small talk, and Elena found she had even less patience for pretending interest she did not feel. Instead, they spoke of books she had read in her father's modest library, of the small kindnesses and frustrations of managing a household on limited means, of the strange isolation Julian described feeling within his own grand house, surrounded by servants and staff who addressed him with careful formality, but rarely with anything resembling genuine warmth. "Do you know," he told her one afternoon as they walked along the edge of the wheat field, now beginning to turn gold with the approaching harvest, "I cannot recall the last time someone laughed genuinely in my presence, rather than laughing because they believed it was expected of them." "That sounds like a lonely way to live," Elena said, surprised by how easily the observation came to her, and by how true it felt the moment she said it aloud. "It is," Julian admitted, though I had grown so accustomed to it that I rarely noticed the weight of it until recently. She glanced sideways at him, uncertain whether he meant to imply that her presence had changed something in that regard, unwilling to ask directly for fear of what the answer might reveal about her own growing feelings she had not yet found the courage to examine too closely. Her father, for his part, seemed to notice the frequency of these visits without commenting on them directly, though Elena caught him watching with a thoughtful expression whenever Julian's carriage appeared at the gate. He said nothing discouraging, though he offered, once or twice, a gentle reminder that men of Julian's standing often moved through the world with expectations and obligations that people of their own modest circumstances could not fully understand. "I know the difference between our stations, Father," Elena told him one evening, after Julian had departed following an unusually long visit that stretched well into the afternoon. "I am not foolish enough to imagine anything beyond friendly conversation between us." Her father studied her for a long moment, something knowing and slightly sad in his expression. "I did not say you were foolish," he said gently. "I only wish for you to guard your heart carefully, whatever this friendship becomes. Men of his position do not always control the expectations placed upon them by their families and their society, however good their intentions may be." Elena brushed off the warning at the time, though it lingered in the back of her mind in the days that followed, a small, persistent doubt she could not entirely silence. She told herself that Julian sought her company simply because she offered him something rare, honest conversation free of flattery or calculation, nothing more complicated than that. And yet, as the weeks passed and his visits grew steadier still, she found it increasingly difficult to categorize the warmth that had grown between them as simple friendship alone. One afternoon, as autumn began to settle more firmly over the county and the harvest neared its completion, Julian arrived without the usual pretext of estate business entirely, admitting as much the moment he found her near the garden. "I confess," he said, a faint, almost boyish uncertainty in his voice she had not heard from him before. "I have run out of reasonable excuses to justify these visits. The fields require little further attention from me at this point, and yet, here I am." Elena felt her heart quicken at the admission, though she kept her expression carefully composed. "Perhaps you have simply grown fond of the walk," she offered lightly, unwilling to name the deeper possibility hovering unspoken between them. "Perhaps," Julian said, though the look he gave her suggested he, too, recognized the words for the gentle deflection they were. "Or perhaps I have grown fond of the company I find waiting at the end of it." Neither of them spoke further on the matter that day, though something had shifted, unmistakably, in the air between them. A quiet acknowledgement neither was yet prepared to voice more plainly. Elena walked back to the house that evening with her thoughts in more disarray than they had been since that first terrible dinner, uncertain whether the warmth spreading through her chest was hope or fear, or some tangled combination of both, and entirely unaware of how quickly the wider county would begin to take notice of the Duke's growing attention toward the estate manager's daughter, and how swiftly that attention would bring troubles neither of them had yet anticipated. The whispers reached Elena before she fully understood their source, carried through the careful, sideways glances of neighbors at the market, through the sudden silences that fell whenever she entered a shop where women had been speaking in low, urgent tones only moments before. It was her aunt who finally told her plainly, returning from the village one afternoon with her mouth pressed into a thin, worried line. "They are saying the Duke rides to your father's estate 3 times a week," her aunt said, setting down her basket with more force than necessary. "They are saying he has eyes for you, Elena, and not all of them mean it kindly when they say it." Elena felt her stomach tighten. "It is not as scandalous as they make it sound. We speak, that is all. I know what it looks like to you," her aunt said, "but you must understand how it looks to them. A duke does not simply speak with the daughter of an estate manager 3 times a week without the entire county drawing its own conclusions, and not all of those conclusions will be generous toward you, whatever the truth may be." The warning settled uneasily in Elena's chest, though she told herself the gossip of idle neighbors mattered little compared to the genuine friendship, or whatever it had become, that had grown between herself and Julian. She continued her walks along the garden path, continued the conversations that had come to mean more to her than she was fully prepared to admit, even as the whispers around the county grew louder and less kind with each passing week. It was not long after that a carriage arrived at Ashford Hall's gate one crisp morning, far grander than any Elena had seen before, bearing an emblem she did not recognize at first, though the steward who greeted her murmured the name with unmistakable deference. Lady Margaret Ashford, Julian's elder sister, had returned from her residence in the capital, and she had requested, in terms that left little room for refusal, a private audience with Elena before the day was through. Elena arrived at the appointed hour with a nervous flutter she could not entirely suppress, led once again through the winding corridors of Ashford Hall, though this time toward a smaller, more formal sitting room where a woman of striking composure sat waiting, her posture perfectly straight, her expression unreadable. "Miss Whitmore," Lady Margaret said, rising just enough to acknowledge her entrance before settling back into her chair, a clear signal that this meeting would not extend the same warmth Julian's had. "Thank you for coming so promptly." "Of course," Elena said carefully, taking the seat offered to her, aware of the careful, assessing way Lady Margaret's gaze moved over her simple dress, her unadorned hands, every detail catalogued and weighed against some invisible standard. "I will not waste your time with pleasantries," Lady Margaret said. "I am aware of the growing talk surrounding you and my brother. I am also aware that you may not fully understand the weight of what you are entangling yourself in, and so I feel it is my responsibility to explain it to you plainly." Elena's spine straightened despite the unease coiling in her stomach. "I am entangled in nothing, my lady. Your brother and I speak. Nothing more has passed between us that I am aware of." "Perhaps not yet," Lady Margaret said, her voice cool but not entirely unkind. "But I have watched my brother closely for many years, Miss Whitmore, and I have never seen him seek out anyone's company the way he has sought yours these past weeks. I do not say this to frighten you, though I imagine it will regardless. I say it because I do not believe you understand what you may be inviting into your life, nor what my brother has already endured." He told me of Fenwick, Elena said quietly. Of the betrayal, the losses. Something flickered across Lady Margaret's composed features, surprise perhaps, that Julian had shared so much. Then you know a portion of it, she said, though perhaps not all. What you may not know is that Fenwick was not the first to use my brother's trust against him. There was a woman, some years before, who courted his affection with great skill, only to abandon him the moment a wealthier prospect presented himself elsewhere. 3. Julian has spent years building walls around himself because of wounds like these. Walls I have watched him construct brick by careful brick. I do not wish to see them dismantled carelessly, only for him to be hurt again by someone who may not fully understand the world she is stepping into. I have no interest in his title or his fortune, Elena said, the words coming more fiercely than she intended. If that is what you fear, my lady, you may set your mind at ease. I did not seek him out. I did not ask for any of this. I believe you, Lady Margaret said, somewhat to Elena's surprise. Which is precisely why I am speaking to you now, rather than dismissing you as some calculating opportunist, as others in this county surely will, whatever the truth of your intentions may be. I do not doubt your sincerity, Miss Whitmore. I doubt whether sincerity alone is enough to survive what awaits you both if this continues. The nobility will not welcome you easily. They will question your motives at every turn, no matter how honest your heart remains, and my brother, whatever his feelings may be, has a duty to this family, to this name, that he cannot simply set aside for personal happiness, however much he might wish to. The words landed with quiet, devastating precision, each one confirming fears Elena had tried, without much success, to keep buried since the whispers first began. What would you have me do? She asked finally, her voice smaller than she intended. Step back, Lady Margaret said simply. Before either of you grows more attached than you already are, spare yourself the cruelty this county will show you, and spare my brother the difficult choice between his heart and his responsibilities. It would be a kindness to you both, though I recognize it may not feel that way now. Elena left Ashford Hall that afternoon with Lady Margaret's words echoing relentlessly in her mind, each one settling deeper into the doubts she had already been struggling to silence. She thought of her father's own gentle warning weeks earlier, of the careful way he had cautioned her to guard her heart. She thought of the whispers in the market, the sideways glances, the certainty in every voice that a match between herself and a duke was not simply unlikely, but somehow improper, a disruption of an order the entire county seemed determined to protect. In the days that followed, Elena began, deliberately and painfully, to withdraw. When Julian arrived at the estate, she found reasons to remain occupied with household tasks, sending her father to walk the fields with him instead, offering only brief, polite greetings when their paths crossed, rather than the easy, honest conversations that had grown so precious to her. She told herself it was for the best, that Lady Margaret's warning, however unwelcome, carried a truth she could not simply dismiss out of stubbornness or wishful feeling. Julian noticed the change almost immediately, his visits growing shorter, his expression carrying a confusion that gradually shifted into something more wounded, as the pattern continued. He did not press her at first, respecting the distance she seemed determined to maintain, though Elena caught him watching her more than once with an expression she recognized, uncomfortably, as the same guarded hurt she imagined must have shadowed his face during the long, lonely months following Fenwick's betrayal. It was nearly 2 weeks before he finally confronted her directly, catching her alone near the old stone fence one gray afternoon, the autumn wind carrying the last of the fallen leaves across the path between them. You have been avoiding me, he said, without preamble, his voice carrying none of its usual careful composure. I would like to know why, if you are willing to tell me the truth, as you have always been so quick to demand of others. Elena felt the weight of his gaze, the rawness in his tone, and knew she owed him more honesty than she had shown him these past 2 weeks, however difficult the conversation might prove to be. Your sister came to see me, she admitted finally. She spoke to me of what awaits us both, if this continues, the whispers, the judgment, the duty you carry that I cannot fully understand. She was not unkind, but she was honest, and I have not been able to stop thinking of everything she said since. Julian's jaw tightened, something like anger flickering across his features, though it did not seem directed at her. My sister means well, he said, though she has a habit of deciding what is best for those she loves, without first asking whether they agree with her assessment. What did she tell you precisely? That I do not understand what I am inviting into my life, Elena said quietly. That you have been hurt before, more than once, and that I may hurt you again without meaning to, simply by being unable to survive the judgment of a world I was not raised to navigate. She asked me to step back, for both our sakes. And is that what you wish to do? Julian asked, his voice quieter now, though the tension in his shoulders had not eased. Step back, because my sister believes it wise? Elena hesitated, searching for an answer that felt entirely her own, rather than one shaped by fear, or by the careful warnings of people who claimed to know better than she did what her own heart could withstand. I do not know, she admitted finally. I know that every part of me wishes to continue these conversations, these walks, this friendship that has come to mean more to me than I expected. But I also know that I am afraid, Julian, of becoming someone the world sees only as an opportunist, of costing you something you cannot afford to lose, for the sake of feelings I am not even certain you share as deeply as I fear I have begun to. The admission hung in the cold autumn air between them, more honest than she had intended to be, and yet, she realized, exactly the kind of honesty Julian had told her, from the very beginning, that he valued above all else. Julian was quiet for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the horizon where the last light of afternoon was beginning to fade behind the hills. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a weight she had not heard from him before, stripped of the careful control he usually maintained so effortlessly. I have spent a year building walls to protect myself from exactly the kind of hurt my sister fears for me, he said. I told myself those walls were wisdom, hard-earned through betrayal, and perhaps they were. But I have also come to understand, these past weeks, that a life spent guarding against every possible wound is not truly a life at all. It is simply a slower, quieter kind of loss, one I chose for myself rather than one forced upon me. He turned to face her fully, and Elena saw, for the first time since she had known him, something unguarded and entirely without pretense in his expression. I do not know what the county will say, or how long their judgment will last, or whether my sister's fears will prove justified in ways neither of us can yet foresee. What I do know is that these past weeks, walking this path with you, speaking honestly with someone who has never once flattered me, or sought anything from me beyond genuine conversation, have meant more to me than anything else in my life since Fenwick's betrayal took so much from me. I am not willing to lose that simply because it is difficult, or because it invites whispers I have weathered before and can weather again. Elena felt tears gather unexpectedly at the corners of her eyes, though she blinked them back, unwilling to let emotion overwhelm the moment before she had said what needed saying. I am frightened, she admitted. Not of you, but of everything that surrounds you, everything I do not know how to navigate. I am frightened too, Julian said, a faint, rueful smile touching his mouth for the first time since their conversation began. I have simply grown more skilled at hiding it than you have, though I suspect that skill has cost me more than it has ever protected me. They stood together in the fading light, the distance between them narrowing slowly, neither entirely certain what came next, though both sensing, for the first time in weeks, that whatever waited ahead was worth facing together rather than retreating from separately out of fear. I do not wish to step back, Elena said finally, the words emerging with more certainty than she had felt in days, whatever the county decides to say about it. Nor do I, Julian said quietly, wish for you to disappear from my life simply because loving honestly has always proven more difficult than hiding behind careful distance. Perhaps it is time I stopped choosing the easier path, whatever the cost of the harder one might be. Neither of them spoke further that evening of what precisely lay ahead, though something unspoken had settled firmly between them, a quiet resolve neither Lady Margaret's warnings nor the county's whispers had managed to fully dismantle. Elena walked home that night with a lighter heart than she had carried in weeks, though she knew, even as hope bloomed cautiously in her chest, that the hardest test of what had grown between them, the moment it would truly be tried before the eyes of the world that judged them both so carefully, had not yet arrived. That test arrived sooner than either of them expected, in the form of an invitation to the county's annual harvest gathering, a grand affair hosted each year at the largest estate in the region, drawing every family of standing for an evening of dinner, dancing, and the kind of careful social maneuvering that shaped reputations for months afterward. Elena's family had never before received an invitation to such an event, their modest standing placing them well outside the usual guest list, and so it came as a considerable shock when a formal card arrived at their door bearing the gathering's crest, addressed personally to Miss Elena Whitmore. He arranged this, her father said, turning the card over in his hands as though searching for some hidden explanation. There is no other reason our family would receive such an invitation. Elena felt a knot of anxiety tighten in her stomach even as a small, cautious hope stirred alongside it. She had not seen Julian since their conversation at the stone fence, though a brief note had arrived 2 days prior, simple and direct, asking only that she attend the gathering if she was willing, promising nothing beyond his hope that she would be there. Her aunt spent the following days helping her prepare a gown from fabric they could scarcely afford, insisting that whatever judgment awaited her at the gathering, Elena would not face it looking anything less than every bit as worthy of the room as anyone else within it. On the evening of the event, Elena stood before the small mirror in her room, studying her reflection with a nervous uncertainty she had not felt since that very first summons to Ashford Hall. "You look every bit a lady deserving of that room," her aunt said softly, adjusting a small strand of pearls, the only jewelry the family owned, around Elena's neck. "Whatever anyone says tonight, remember that." The carriage ride to the gathering felt longer than any journey Elena had taken before, each mile bringing her closer to a room full of people who had spent weeks whispering about her, judging a connection they understood only through rumor and speculation. When she finally arrived, the grand hall glittering with candlelight and filled with the low murmur of 100 conversations, she felt every eye turn toward her the moment she crossed the threshold, felt the whispers ripple outward like water disturbed by a stone. She held her chin steady, remembering her aunt's words, remembering the courage that had carried her through that first dinner months ago, and made her way slowly into the room, searching discreetly for a familiar face among the unfamiliar crowd of silk and jewels and carefully composed smiles. She found Julian near the far end of the hall, engaged in conversation with a cluster of men she did not recognize, though the moment his eyes found hers across the room, he excused himself without hesitation, crossing the distance between them with a purposeful stride that drew even more attention than her own arrival had. "You came," he said, relief evident in his voice as he reached her side. "You asked me to," she said simply, though her heart hammered against her ribs at the nearness of him, at the awareness of every gaze in the room now fixed upon them both. "I am glad," Julian said, and then, with a boldness that seemed to still even the low murmur of surrounding conversation, he offered her his arm, guiding her further into the room, rather than allowing her to remain at the edges where she might have preferred to stay hidden from the weight of so much attention. Whispers followed them as they moved, some sharp with disapproval, others merely curious, though Elena forced herself to keep her posture steady, refusing to let the judgment in the room shrink her the way it so clearly hoped to. Julian, for his part, seemed entirely unbothered by the attention, his manner toward her deliberate and unhurried, a clear statement to anyone watching that whatever connection existed between them, he had no intention of concealing it out of deference to their expectations. It was Lady Margaret who approached them first, emerging from a cluster of finely dressed guests with an expression Elena could not immediately read, somewhere between resignation and reluctant curiosity. "Brother," she said, her gaze flicking briefly to Elena before returning to Julian, "I see you have chosen to disregard my advice entirely." "I have chosen to be honest, Margaret," Julian said, his tone gentle but firm, "which is a different matter altogether from disregarding you. I know you spoke to Miss Whitmore out of concern for my well-being, and I am grateful for it, truly. But I have spent enough of my life avoiding what might hurt me that I have forgotten, until recently, what it feels like to pursue something simply because it might bring genuine happiness instead." Lady Margaret studied her brother for a long moment, something in her expression softening incrementally, though she did not entirely abandon her guarded composure. "And you, Miss Whitmore," she said, turning her attention fully to Elena, "are you prepared for what this room will say of you, long after tonight has ended?" Elena met her gaze steadily, drawing on every ounce of the courage that had carried her through that first difficult dinner months earlier. "I cannot control what this room says of me, my lady," she said. "I learned that lesson the very night I first met your brother, when I spoke honestly to a man I did not yet know was a duke, and paid for it with sleepless nights of worry, over consequences I could not predict. I have decided I would rather live with honest consequences than hide behind careful silence for the sake of avoiding judgment that will likely find me regardless." Something flickered across Lady Margaret's face, an expression that might, in different circumstances, have resembled respect. "Well," she said finally, "I suppose there is little more I can say to that." She inclined her head slightly toward Elena, a small formal gesture that nonetheless carried the weight of a boundary tentatively lowered. "I wish you both well then, whatever comes of it." As Lady Margaret withdrew back into the crowd, Julian turned to Elena, something like quiet wonder in his expression. "I do not believe my sister has conceded a point so gracefully in all the years I have known her," he said. "Perhaps she simply recognized honesty when she heard it," Elena said, though her hands were trembling slightly with the effort of that exchange, the weight of the room's attention still pressing heavily against her. As the evening wore on, the whispers did not entirely fade, though their edges softened gradually as guests observed the easy, genuine warmth between Julian and Elena, a warmth that seemed increasingly difficult to dismiss as mere scandal or opportunism the longer it was witnessed firsthand. Several older members of the county's most established families approached Julian throughout the evening, their questions carefully probing, testing the seriousness of his intentions, and each time, he answered with the same unhurried honesty, refusing to soften his regard for Elena simply to ease their discomfort. Near the end of the evening, as the musicians began a slower piece and couples gathered on the floor, Julian extended his hand toward Elena, a silent invitation that carried far more weight than a simple request to dance. "Are you certain?" Elena asked quietly, aware of the eyes that would inevitably follow them onto the floor. "This will settle any remaining doubt in this room about what exists between us." "I am certain," Julian said, "and I find, rather to my own surprise, that I no longer wish for any doubt to remain. I have spent long enough allowing fear and caution to dictate the shape of my life. I would rather this room understand clearly what I feel, than continue whispering half-formed guesses in corners." Elena placed her hand in his, and they moved onto the floor together, the room's attention settling fully upon them as the music carried them through slow, careful steps. Whatever murmurs continued around the edges of the hall, Elena found she could not bring herself to care as deeply as she had feared she would, caught instead in the quiet, steady warmth of Julian's gaze, in the simple, undeniable rightness of the moment, despite everything that had threatened to prevent it. When the dance ended, Julian did not release her hand immediately, drawing her instead toward a quieter corner of the hall, away from the thickest press of guests, where the noise of the gathering faded into a more bearable murmur behind them. "I owe you an apology I have not yet properly given," he said, his voice low and earnest. "Not simply for that first evening at your father's table, though certainly for that as well, but for every moment since when I allowed fear, whether my own or my sister's, to create distance between us that neither of us truly wanted. You do not owe me further apology," Elena said gently. "You have shown me tonight, in front of everyone who matters to your world, exactly where your feelings stand. That is worth more than any words could offer." Julian studied her for a long moment, something tender and unguarded in his expression that she had never seen from him before that evening. "I told you once that you taught me honesty still exists in this world, even among those with far less power than I hold," he said. "I did not fully understand that night how much I would come to need that honesty in my own life, nor how much I would come to treasure the person who offered it to me so freely, without ever asking for anything in return." Elena felt her heart swell with an emotion she had been too afraid to name fully until this moment, watching the sincerity in his eyes, the vulnerability he had allowed himself to show in a room full of people who had, until tonight, seemed determined to judge them both so harshly. "I never sought your title, or your fortune," she said softly. "I only ever sought fairness for my father, and somehow, along the way, I found something I never expected to find at all." "As did I," Julian said, "though I confess I am still learning how to hold something so honestly given, without the fear of losing it, the way I have lost so much before." "Perhaps," Elena said, "we can learn that together, rather than each of us guarding against it alone." Julian smiled then, a genuine, unguarded smile that transformed his usually composed features into something warmer, something entirely without the careful distance he had carried since the day she first met him. "I would like that very much," he said. In the weeks that followed, the whispers of the county gradually settled into a quieter, more resigned acceptance, as it became clear that whatever connection had grown between the Duke of Ashford and the estate manager's daughter was neither fleeting nor born of calculation, but something steady and genuine that showed little sign of fading under continued scrutiny. Her father's position remained secure, the estate flourishing under the renewed investment Julian had provided, and slowly, cautiously, the family that had once feared ruin over a single outspoken moment at a dinner table found themselves instead standing at the edge of a future neither of them could have imagined on that difficult night months before. Elena often thought back to that first evening, to the anger that had driven her to her feet in defense of her father, certain in that moment that she had destroyed whatever fragile hope remained for her family's future. She had not known, could not have known, that the very honesty which seemed so reckless in the moment would become the foundation of everything that followed, that the rude stranger she had confronted so boldly would turn out to be not merely a duke who owned half the county, but a man capable of genuine change, genuine warmth, and a love built not on flattery or convenience, but on the simple, rare gift of being spoken to honestly, without fear, exactly as he was. She stood now, months later, at the edge of the very fields where her father had once told her she reminded him of her mother's fearless heart, watching the sun set golden over land that no longer felt uncertain beneath her feet, and understood, at last, that standing up for what mattered had cost her nothing in the end but the fear of an uncertain future, a fear that had given way, through honesty and courage neither of them had expected to need. to something far steadier and far more lasting than either of them had dared to hope for on that first, difficult night.